You don't meet them by accident. It feels like recognition, like something ancient inside you whispers, "Here, this one understands." But what you're really sensing is not understanding, it's intensity. And your nervous system, trained since early moments you barely remember, confuses intensity with connection. Somewhere deep, the empath in you learned to read storms as home. They notice you immediately, not because you're loud, but because you feel. You listen between words, you soften your gaze, you leave space. To someone who feeds on attention, that space feels like an invitation. Not a trap, just an open door. And you've always been the one who leaves doors open. There is a strange magnetism here. You feel their pain before they ever show it. And when you sense pain, something in you awakens, a quiet mission, almost sacred. To soothe, to understand, to stay. The empath doesn't chase people, but you do lean toward wounds. They mirror you at first, not consciously, not always, but they reflect your depth, your dreams, your way of seeing the world. It feels uncanny, like finally meeting someone who speaks your invisible language. But look closer, it's not a shared language. It's a reflection designed to keep you looking. And then something shifts, subtle at first. A tone, a pause, a withdrawal. You feel it immediately, of course you do. And because you feel it, you move toward it. You try to restore the harmony, to bring things back to what they were. But what you don't see yet is that the harmony was never real. This is where your deepest trigger awakens. Not fear of losing them, but fear of losing connection itself. Because somewhere in your story, love became something you had to maintain. Something fragile. Something that could disappear if you stopped paying attention. So you don't stop. They begin to take more space. You begin to take less. Not consciously, just slowly. You explain their behavior. You translate their silence. You carry both sides of the relationship inside yourself. And because you can feel so much, you believe you understand them. But understanding someone is not the same as being safe with them. There's a quiet exhaustion now. Not loud enough to make you leave, just enough to make you question yourself. You start wondering if you're too sensitive, too emotional, too much. And that question, it didn't start here. It just found a familiar place to live again. This is the hidden bond. Not love, not fate, but familiarity. The nervous system recognizes what it has known before. The unpredictability, the need to adapt, the subtle emotional distance. And it says, I know how to survive this. But survival is not the same as love. And one day, a quieter voice appears. Not urgent, not dramatic, just clear. It doesn't ask you to fix them. It doesn't ask you to stay. It asks something else. What if your empathy was never meant to be a bridge for others to cross, but a boundary that protects you? Because the moment you turn that empathy inward, the pattern begins to loosen. You start noticing something uncomfortable. It's not just them. It's the way you enter the connection, the way you scan, adjust, anticipate, the way you become what is needed before anyone asks. And suddenly, the question changes, not why do they choose me, but why do I stay available for this? The empath doesn't lack strength. You've endured emotional landscapes others wouldn't survive. But your strength has been outward-facing, given, offered, extended, and now something deeper is asking you to turn it inward, to hold yourself with the same devotion you gave so freely. You begin to see the pattern before it fully forms, the charm that feels slightly too intense, the connection that accelerates too quickly, the subtle imbalance of giving and receiving. And instead of leaning in, you pause. That pause, it changes everything. There is grief here, not just for the person, but for the illusion, for the version of connection you hoped was real, for the story you quietly built in your mind. Let it be there. The empath often skips grief by turning it into understanding. But this time, just feel it. Something unexpected happens when you stop overgiving. The right people don't disappear. They step closer. They meet you. They don't need to be healed, decoded, or managed. And at first, it might feel unfamiliar, even slightly uncomfortable, because peace is quieter than chaos. You begin to trust your discomfort, not as something to fix, but as information. Your body has always known. It just learned to be overridden. Now, you listen differently. You don't explain away the red flags. You don't translate behavior into potential. You see what is. The attraction shifts. You're no longer drawn to intensity alone. You start noticing consistency, presence, emotional safety, and something inside you relaxes, not because you found the perfect person, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself in the process. The empath doesn't stop being empathic. You don't become cold or closed. You become clear. Your empathy becomes selective, intentional, not a reflex, but a choice. And suddenly, it stops being something others take and becomes something you give wisely. There's a quiet power here. Not loud, not performative, just steady. You don't need to prove your worth through how much you can hold for someone else. You don't need to earn love by understanding pain. You simply stand in your own presence. And now, when you meet someone, it feels different. Not like a storm, not like a pull, more like a calm recognition. No urgency, no illusion, just two people meeting as they are. And maybe this is the truth that was always waiting beneath everything. The empath was never meant to lose themselves in connection, but to find themselves through it. You don't attract them because you are weak. That idea is too simple, almost insulting to what you carry. You attract them because you are perceptive. You notice what others miss, the micro-expressions, the hidden sadness behind confidence, the fracture beneath control. And to someone who survives by being seen, your attention feels like oxygen. There is also something quieter, almost invisible. You don't just see people, you allow them. You make space for contradictions, for flaws, for unfinished parts. Where others set boundaries quickly, you stay curious. And that curiosity, it can look like permission to someone who doesn't know limits. They sense your tolerance for complexity, your ability to hold tension without breaking. Where others would walk away, you lean in and ask, "What happened to you?" But the empath's gift of understanding can become a doorway through which harmful patterns quietly enter. You are not drawn to narcissism itself, you are drawn to potential, to the glimpse of who they could be beneath everything. And once you've seen that glimpse, it becomes hard to unsee. You begin relating not to who they are, but to who they almost are. And here is the paradox: you feel deeply, but you often doubt your feelings. You sense something is off early, but you question it. You give the benefit of the doubt. You reinterpret discomfort as misunderstanding. This self-doubt softens your boundaries in ways you don't immediately notice. There is also a rhythm you've known before, emotional inconsistency that keeps you alert, moments of closeness followed by distance, warmth that suddenly cools. It creates a kind of internal pull, unresolved, unfinished. And your system, wired to seek resolution, keeps engaging. You don't chase attention, but you do respond to emotional signals quickly. When someone withdraws, you feel it. When someone shifts, you adjust. And over time, this responsiveness can create an imbalance. You become the regulator of the connection while they become the center of it. Sometimes it's not even about them at first. It's about the feeling of being deeply seen in the beginning. The intensity, the focus, the sense that someone has finally recognized your depth. That moment can be intoxicating, not because it's real, but because it touches something you've longed for. You also carry a quiet resilience. You can endure emotional discomfort longer than most. You can sit with confusion, with ambiguity, with unresolved tension. And while that strength is real, it can also keep you in places where clarity should have led you away. And slowly, a deeper understanding forms. It was never just about why they come into your life. It's about what in you remains open to them. Not as a flaw, but as an invitation to become more conscious. Because the same openness that allowed this can also be refined into something wiser, something stronger, something that no longer confuses depth with danger. There is a moment you begin to notice, not in them, but in yourself. The moment when you start translating their behavior into meaning. You become the interpreter of silence, the decoder of distance. And the more you interpret, the less you actually see what is there. You were never taught to take things at face value. You were taught to look deeper, to read between lines, to sense what is hidden. But sometimes what is shown plainly is the truth. And the empath, searching for depth, can miss the simplicity of what is. There is also your relationship with endings. You don't leave easily, not because you can't, but because you feel the story isn't finished. You sense there is more to understand, more to heal, more to uncover. And that sense of not yet keeps you connected long after clarity has already arrived. You carry loyalty like something sacred. Once you've opened your heart, you don't close it quickly. Even when something feels wrong, you stay true to what you felt in the beginning. But beginnings are not promises. They are just beginnings. There is a quiet hope that lives in you. Not loud, not naive, just persistent. The belief that if you show enough understanding, enough patience, something will shift. That the connection will return to what it once felt like. But what if that feeling was never meant to last? You are also deeply attuned to emotional pain. When you sense it in someone, it softens you. It makes you compassionate, forgiving, willing to stay. But not all pain asks to be healed. Some pain is used, consciously or not, to keep you close. And there is something else, your identity. Being the one who understands, who supports, who holds space. It has become familiar, meaningful. So when that role is activated, it feels like purpose. Even if, quietly, it is costing you yourself. You don't fear conflict as much as you fear disconnection. So instead of confronting, you adapt. You smooth things over, you adjust your tone, your needs, your presence. And in doing so, you maintain the bond, but lose parts of your truth. There is a subtle exchange happening. You offer empathy, presence, emotional labor. And in return, you receive intensity, attention, moments of closeness. Feels like something, but it is not the same as being met fully. You often give before you receive. Not as a strategy, but as a reflex. You lead with openness, with care, with emotional availability. And while this is beautiful, in the wrong dynamic, it creates an imbalance from the very beginning. There is also your comfort with ambiguity. You can live in the gray space between certainty and doubt. You can hold contradictions without needing immediate resolution. But that same tolerance can keep you in cycles that never truly resolve. You trust in transformation, in growth, in the idea that people can change. And they can. But not because you love them enough. Not because you stay long enough. Change requires something they must choose, not something you can create. There is a pattern of over-responsibility. When something feels off, you look inward first. What did I miss? What can I do differently? This self-reflection is powerful, but in certain dynamics, it becomes self-blame. And yet, beneath all of this, there is clarity trying to emerge. A quiet knowing that doesn't argue, doesn't explain, doesn't justify. It simply observes. It sees the pattern without needing to fix it. And that awareness, it begins to loosen the bond. Because in the end, it was never about stopping yourself from attracting certain people. It was about no longer abandoning yourself once they arrive. And when that shifts, when you stay with yourself fully, the attraction changes, the pattern dissolves, and what once felt inevitable simply no longer finds a place to stay. There is a subtle shift that begins almost invisibly. You stop asking, why are they like this? And start asking something quieter, more unsettling. Why does this feel familiar? And in that question, something ancient stirs. Not memory as a story, but memory as a feeling. Because what you call attraction is often recognition. Not of the person, but of the emotional landscape. The tension, the distance, the longing to be chosen. It echoes something you've already learned to navigate. And the empath, you are very good at navigating. You learned early how to stay connected without being fully met. How to read moods, how to adjust yourself, how to keep the bond alive even when it thinned. This wasn't weakness. It was intelligence. It was survival shaped into sensitivity. And now, that same intelligence brings you into spaces where you can feel needed, where your presence matters, where your ability to understand holds weight. But being needed is not the same as being loved. It just feels louder. There is also your relationship with invisibility. You've known what it means to not be fully seen, even while being deeply aware of others. So when someone finally focuses on you intensely, completely, it touches something deep. Feels like arrival, even if it's temporary. You are drawn not just to people, but to emotional depth. And narcissistic patterns often carry intensity, highs and lows, closeness and distance, energy that pulls you in. Feels like depth, but depth without safety becomes a labyrinth. There is a moment always where you feel the misalignment, a flicker, a hesitation, something doesn't quite land. But instead of trusting it, you move closer. You try to understand it away. You give it context, meaning, compassion. And in doing so, you override yourself. Your empathy extends outward effortlessly. Inward, it has been quieter, less practiced. So when conflict arises between what you feel and what you hope, hope often wins. Not because it's stronger, but because it feels kinder. You don't want to reduce people to labels. You see nuance, complexity, layers. And that's true. But in protecting that truth, you sometimes blur the clarity of your own experience. You hesitate to name what hurts you because naming feels like judgment. And yet, something in you is beginning to name things differently. Not harshly, not reactively, just honestly. You begin to say, "This doesn't feel good," not as an accusation, but as a truth. And that truth starts to anchor you. You begin to notice where you give from overflow and where you give from emptiness, where your empathy flows naturally, and where it is used to hold something that was never yours to carry. This distinction changes the way you connect. There is grief in this awakening, not just for the connections, but for the parts of you that believed love had to feel like effort, like endurance, like waiting. Let that grief move through you. It is not breaking you, it is clearing space. And then, something unexpected happens. You become less interesting to the patterns that once found you so easily. Not because you've closed yourself, but because you no longer respond in the same way. The door is still there, but it is no longer open. Your presence changes. There is a steadiness now, a quiet boundary that doesn't need to be explained. You listen, but you don't absorb. You care, but you don't carry. And in that subtle shift, the dynamic cannot take root. You begin to meet people who don't require translation, who are as they appear, who don't pull you into analysis, but invite you into presence. At first, it may feel almost too simple, but simplicity is what safety feels like. And now, at the edge of this understanding, something becomes clear. You were never attracting something wrong. You were responding from something unexamined. And once it is seen, truly seen, it loses its hold. So the question dissolves. Not why do empaths attract narcissists, but something deeper, something quieter. What happens when the empath no longer abandons themselves in the presence of another? And in that moment, the answer is not spoken. It is lived. If this resonated with you, share in the comments what part felt the most familiar in your own experience. Your perspective might help someone else recognize their own pattern a little more clearly. And if you want to continue exploring this deeper work on empathy, psychology, and inner awareness, you can subscribe to stay with the next insights. Thank you for watching.